Thank you, Suzanne. Welcome, everyone, for another great evening of conversation, learning, and listening here at WAPA Virtual Land. This evening's topic is, I think, another interesting one, in which it's on the subject, or the topic name is The Archaeology of Enslaved Children in Antebellum America. We're really excited this evening to have Samantha Lee, our speaker. She's a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Maryland, College Park. She graduated from George Washington University in 2016 in sociocultural anthropology and archaeology. And she applied her master's at the University of Maryland as well in 2019. So she's currently working on her doctoral research, focusing on the experiences of enslaved children in antebellum United States and how their lives and contributions are represented in the archaeological record. This evening, she's going to guide us through some of the previous experiences that she's had as it relates to the complexity of plantations that were present in Alexandria, Virginia. And afterwards, after her presentation, there'll be opportunity for questions and answers. So I'm not going to take any more time away from her. I'm going to hand it over to Samantha.
Hi, everyone. I'm Samantha. I have a whole PowerPoint presentation ready, so if everyone's all right with that, I'm just gonna dive in, I think. All right, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So this work, as mentioned before, is based on my doctoral research. And just to provide a little context, why is it not? Okay, there. What are the questions guiding this work? I'm interested in this topic because nobody has approached it in depth archaeologically before. Some of the questions I've been thinking about are, what were the child rearing practices on plantations? What kind of labor were children during enslavement responsible for? And how many children were sold within the domestic slave trade? In terms of archaeology, how were enslaved children represented in the archaeological record? What kinds of material culture can they be associated with? How can the limitations of archaeological evidence regarding enslaved children provide a contribution to the understanding of American slavery? Frederick Douglass wrote, "Children have their sorrows as well as men and women, and it would be well to remember this in our dealings with them. Slave children are children and prove no exceptions to the general rule. Although enslaved children were still children, they were also exposed to undue amounts of hardship and violence that impacted them for the rest of their lives." Will McKing argues that enslaved children had virtually no childhood because they entered the workplace early and were subjected to arbitrary authority, punishment, and separation, just as adults were. These experiences made them grow old before their time. In this way, enslaved children represent an enigma. They were children without childhoods. They were not allowed the privilege of having a distinctive period of youth, yet they still exhibited behavior typical of children, participating in games, telling ghost stories, and playing with toys, while at the same time undergoing the trauma, pain, and violence that accompanied their status as enslaved persons. The experience of being enslaved directly influenced the way that children interacted with material culture and the way that they might be represented in the archaeological record. Enslaved children occupied a complex role due to their positions as being both children and enslaved. The ways in which they were treated and the jobs that they were responsible for differed widely depending on their specific situations. This complexity is something that is overlooked by historical archaeologists who continue to identify enslaved children archaeologically through artifacts traditionally associated with free children. However, enslaved children were not free and therefore must be considered in different ways. Their archaeological impact is different from that of free children and is something that should be considered in archaeological interpretations. In order to comprehend the significance of the role enslaved children played on the plantation and in the quarters, one must interrogate the archives and ask more questions to produce more potentialities, possible situations that occurred that may shed light on how enslaved children are represented in the material record. Neglecting the impact of enslaved children on the material record is an injustice because it both infantilizes them as well as detracts from their lived experiences, importance, and contributions to the survival of their families and communities, as well as the economy. Additionally, ignoring the possibility of enslaved children in archaeological interpretations is to lose the opportunity to learn more about American slavery and the experiences of enslaved people in the United States in general. So the main goal of this dissertation is to provide an archaeological study which centers on the lives and experiences of enslaved children in antebellum America and their impact on the material record. The goal here isn't to say this artifact is definitively associated with an enslaved child, but rather to encourage other archaeologists to consider the possibility that children may have had more significant roles on a site than previously thought. Archaeologists assume that the presence of adults at a site is a given, but constantly ignore the possibility of children outside of the realm of toys and dolls and other diminutive or small-sized artifacts. Children during enslavement were responsible for a number of jobs, many of which required hard labor or were highly skilled, and this should be taken into account as the material record may reflect this. For the purposes of this research, I define a child as an individual aged 14 or younger. I've determined this age parameter for Michael Tadman's work on the overland domestic slave trade, where traders considered individuals aged 15 to 29 as prime-aged workers who were the most highly sought after. The institution of slavery in the United States was unique from slavery in all other places because American slavery reproduced itself, its most distinctive feature. After the United States banned the importation of enslaved persons in 1808, slaveholders had to rely on the existing enslaved population to birth more children, and thus more workers, maintaining the population of enslaved laborers. By 1860, the enslaved population had risen to nearly 4 million people, with more than 2/5 under the age of 15 and 1/3 younger than age 10. Children made up a significant portion of the enslaved population. Now, before I begin the rest of this talk, I'd like to focus on Isaac White and Rosina Downs. In this photograph, Isaac is 8 years old and Rosina is 6 years old. Rosina looks white, but was enslaved because her mother was enslaved, following the rule of partus sequitur ventrum. Both children were enslaved in New Orleans prior to emancipation in 1863, and cartes de visite with this photograph were sold to raise money for the education of emancipated people in New Orleans. I'm showing this photograph to highlight that slavery cannot be thought of as a nameless, faceless system of oppression. Slavery was the oppression of individuals with their own unique lives and stories, and both of the children in this photo experienced the oppression of enslavement before they were emancipated. So this talk will address 3 main topics. The first, child rearing practices and enslaved children in the domestic slave trade. The second, enslaved children in labor. And the third, children as contributors to their enslaved families and communities. To most slaveholders, children born into enslavement were first and foremost an investment. According to a Georgia slaveholder in his essay on the treatment and management of slaves, quote, "Children of course must be fed and attended as their wants require. They are not likely to be neglected, as they pay a good interest upon the amount of care and expense bestowed upon them." End quote. An overseer on a Mississippi plantation echoed these sentiments in the American Cotton Planter magazine, stating that his employer wanted the young children taken care of especially. His motto was to take care of what he had as the surest way of getting rich, and changed his business model from an emphasis on cotton to an emphasis on raising enslaved children. In his memoir, South Carolina rice planter Elias Ball wrote, "Do 2 things with your money, buy land and buy young slaves." Ball purchased young children often and once purchased 6 enslaved children, all under the age of 10. And in 1819, Thomas Jefferson remarked in a personal letter that, quote, "I consider the labor of a breeding woman as no object, and that a child raised every 2 years is of more profit than the crop of the best laboring man." Jefferson rewarded enslaved women who chose spouses from within the plantation at Monticello or Poplar Forest with a mattress and a cooking pot, and when possible, a house, incentives to ensure that his enslaved workforce continued to grow. In her book, The Price for Their Pound of Flesh, historian Dana Ramey Berry discusses slaveholders purchasing life insurance policies for enslaved children from 6 months old to 10 years old. Berry found that from 1856 to 1863, 43 children were covered by policies through the Southern Mutual Life Insurance Company. According to Berry, the majority, 65% of the sample, of those with policies from birth to 10 years old were actually 10-year-olds, suggesting that enslavers began their valuation of enslaved youth before puberty. Large plantations in the Low Country and Lower South required an immense number of enslaved workers in order to grow the labor-intensive crops of rice and cotton. It is at these plantations that slaveholders utilized nurseries, sometimes referred to as day nurseries, because enslaved mothers would drop their young children off at the nursery in the morning and retrieve them at night after working a day in the fields. The plantation nursery was usually managed by a superannuated enslaved woman who could no longer work in the fields. In general, the day nursery was a substantially sized building located in the slave quarters of a plantation and would have resembled the slave cabins nearby, as shown in an 1862 photograph taken by Henry Moore at Elliott's Plantation in Hilton Head, South Carolina. In his book, A Journey in the Seaboard Slave States, with remarks on their economy, architect Frederick Law Olmsted visits a rice plantation in South Carolina. He describes the nursery there as a cabin with a veranda located next to the overseer's house. Olmsted surmises that there are around 27 children there, most of them infants, watched by an enslaved nurse. In addition to the elderly nurse, a number of girls, 8 or 10 years old, were occupied in holding and tending the youngest infants. In 1853, Thomas Thorpe described a nursery on a Louisiana sugarcane plantation as being 50 feet square. Most nurseries were outfitted with homemade cradles or pallets, and at some rice plantations, fanner baskets, normally used to separate rice from the husks, functioned as cradles. However, there are some accounts that suggest that nurseries on particularly wealthy plantations were specially constructed with the health of young children in mind. In 1832, the editors of Southern Agriculturalist visited James Hamilton Cooper's Georgia plantation, Hopeton. The nursery building was described as remarkably neat and clean, well ventilated, and heated altogether by steam. A steam heating system replaced the need for fireplaces, which required constant tending to and allowed the nurse to better focus her attention on cooking and caring for the children. Additionally, an 1845 account by Susan Epps describes the day nursery at Horseshoe Plantation in Florida as a 4-roomed house with a broad passage running north and south and wide piazzas all around. The rooms were well lighted, generous-sized fireplaces heated them in winter, and a light wood blaze could always be found there on chilly, rainy days in summer. These descriptions of technologically advanced nurseries suggest that slaveholders on those plantations were willing to spend more money to ensure the health and eventual profit of their enslaved children. South Carolina planter James Henry Hammond's 1844 plantation manual includes a separate section regarding the care of enslaved children. He mentions a nursery where the children are kept during the day. Hammond also noted the children's diet. Allowance is given out daily to the children at the rates for each child of 1/3 of meal and meat given to work hands. An abundant supply of vegetables should be always at hand in a garden cultivated for the especial purpose to be cooked with their meat. Each child must have daily at least 1 pint of skimmed milk. Their food should be cooked by the nurse and consist for breakfast and supper of hominy and milk and cold cornbread. Their dinner of vegetable soup, usually pot liquor or okra soup, and dumplings or bread. Cold bread or potatoes should be kept on hand for occasional demands between meals. Their meat may be the same as those given to work hands, except that the only fresh meat allowed to them is the beef bones for soup. They should have a little molasses once or twice a week and a well-roasted potato, sweet potato every day. Each child is provided with a pan and spoon placed in charge of the nurse. This diet, with an emphasis on dairy and starches, is repeated in the advice of enslavers writing in agricultural magazines. A planter from Mississippi said that children must have plenty of suitable food in addition to meat, bread, vegetables, and broth, molasses, and buttermilk, and children at another Mississippi nursery were fed upon cornbread and fat and hominy and molasses. A Georgia slaveholder claimed that no diet suits them better than milk and bread, with meat and vegetables once per day. Interviews from the WPA slave narrative suggest that the most common diets for young children during enslavement included cornbread, ash cake, clabber, which is soured milk, buttermilk, pot liquor, which is a sort of vegetable broth, and boiled greens. Meat and other vegetables were not frequently mentioned. Many formerly enslaved people also recall being fed from troughs. This practice occurred as far north as Maryland, as told by Frederick Douglass when he was enslaved at White House, and as far south as Alabama. In his first autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, he wrote, "We were not regularly allowanced. Our food was coarse cornmeal boiled. This was called mush. It was put into a large wooden tray or trough and set upon the ground. The children were then called like so many pigs, and like so many pigs they would come and devour the mush, some with oyster shells, others with pieces of shingle, some with naked hands, and none with spoons. He that ate fastest got most, he that was strongest secured the best place, and few left the trough satisfied." Thus far, I've never seen a slaveholder explicitly mention that this method of feeding children was practiced. However, far too many formerly enslaved individuals remember eating this way as children for it to have been an uncommon occurrence, so it may have been a method utilized by slaveholders and overseers that was shared privately by word of mouth or through personal correspondence, as it is a particularly disgusting and inhumane technique to admit to using. The belief that young enslaved children were not frequently separated and sold away from their mothers is a common misconception. According to Frederick Bancroft, on the contrary, they were hardly less than a staple in the trade. The selling singly of young children privately and publicly was frequent and notorious. Between 1820 and 1860, children born in the Upper South had a 30% chance of being sold to the Lower South before the age of 10. The reason that so many people believe that young children were not sold away from their parents is probably due to several laws that were passed in the Lower South in order to stop this practice. In Alabama, the Master and Slave Statute stated that children under age 10 should be kept with their mothers unless an execution of sale was levied against an owner's debt, and that no levy of sale shall be made by which a child under 5 years of age shall be separated from its mother. In Louisiana, it was illegal to sell children aged 14 and under away from their parents, and children under age 10 could not be imported, that is, taken to New Orleans by ship, without their mothers, except with proof that the mother was deceased. However, these laws were difficult to enforce, especially because so many enslaved people did not know their exact age, and traders could merely assign ages to young children. Additionally, many children were separated from their mothers by traders in the Upper South, where these laws did not apply. In his research on the overland interregional slave trade, Michael Tadman found that from 1830 to 1850, children aged 14 and under constituted nearly 40% of those traded, around half of which were children aged 9 and younger. Tadman found that for most of the Antebellum period, around 51% of individuals traded from the Upper South to the Lower South would have experienced major family separations. Of that group, children aged 14 and younger who were sold without either parent made up 23%, which accounted for 45% of all major family separations. According to Bancroft, prices for all enslaved people rose significantly in the second half of the 19th century. In the latter part of the 1850s, children from 8 to 10 years of age sometimes sold for more than prime field hands and ordinary mechanics had cost 10 or 12 years earlier. A northern visitor to a Richmond slave market was handed a price current, which listed the prices for enslaved children according to height. Slave trader William Finney wrote the prices he would pay for boys 5 feet tall and under, quote, 3-inch increments matched by $100 increases. Slave traders also paid for children by the pound. John Brown, a formerly enslaved man from Georgia, remembered this in his narrative. Quote, "I was then about or nearly 10 years of age, and after some chaffering about terms, Finney agreed to purchase me by the pound. I do not recollect what I weighed, but the price I was sold for amounted to $310. Children were measured and weighed by the inch and by the pound and priced accordingly, like pieces of meat for sale. This dehumanization transformed children from people into products ready for sale in the market." The age at which enslaved children began working varied according to slaveholders, overseers, or the persons who hired or apprenticed them. Additionally, the size of the household of an owner or employer mattered. Large plantations might need less children to perform chores than on small farms with fewer workers. The size of households varied across regions. Before age 10, most tasks that children were responsible for were not gender-specific. Beginning when children were very young, even starting at 3 or 4 years of age, they were responsible for doing small tasks and chores in order to instill in them a sense of obedience and to acquire habits of perseverance and industry. Mary Island, who was enslaved as a child in Louisiana, remembers beginning to work at 4 years old. She explains the various tasks she performed from age 4 to age 7. "She started me out washing dishes when I was 4 years old, and when I was 6, she was learning me how to cook. While the other hands was working in the field, I carried water. We had to cook out in the yard on an old skillet and lid, so you see I had to tote brush and bark and roll up little logs such as I could to keep the fire from one time of cooking to the other. I was not but 6 years old either. When I got to be 7 years old, I was cutting sprouts almost like a man, and when I was 8, I could pick 100 pounds of cotton. When it rained and we could not go to the field, my auntie had me spinning thread to make socks and cloth. Then I had to card the bats and make the rolls to spin." The jobs that children were forced to perform were not always light and easy tasks. Mary discusses learning to cook on an open flame when she was 6 years old, a dangerous job for a child and a difficult one as well. She had to learn how to make sure that the food was cooked, but also how to control how large or small the fire was so as not to burn or undercook the food. Cooking using an open flame is a difficult task for most adults, so it would have been extremely onerous for a young child, especially one that had to handle a presumably heavy skillet. Young children completed any tasks that were needed at the farm or plantation, and this included working outside and in the plantation house, referred to as the big house. As a young boy, Henry Bibb, who was enslaved in Tennessee, remembered having to clean the floors and polish the furniture, as well as do odd tasks like scratching his mistress's head or rubbing her feet. In the Upper South, children began working in the big house as young as age 6 or 7. Young boys and girls were trained to do domestic work like setting the table, ironing, spinning, weaving, and making candles and soap. Training young girls and boys also allowed slaveholders to provide waiting maids and butlers for their sons and daughters, who would one day need domestic servants when they grew up and established their own households. Many children in the Upper South, Lower South, and Low Country were also responsible for taking care of the younger children. In his farm book, Thomas Jefferson listed jobs for the enslaved children to do at Monticello, according to age. Children till 10 years old to serve as nurses. From 10 to 16, the boys make nails, the girls spin. At 16, go into the grounds or learn trades. At Monticello, there are 2 recorded instances of young enslaved girls working as babysitters or baby minders. Sisters Edie and Aggie Hearn were 2 of the daughters of Davy and Isabel Hearn, who worked as an enslaved carpenter and an enslaved domestic servant. In Jefferson's bread list for 1796, Edie is listed as living with Sally Hemings, who had just given birth to a daughter in October of 1795. Edie would have been 8 or 9 years old at this time, working as a baby minder so that Sally could presumably continue her domestic duties in the plantation house. In the bread list a year later, in 1797, Edie's younger sister Aggie is listed as living with Sally and her baby, and Edie is listed as having moved back with their family on the mountain. At that time, Aggie, who would have also been around 8 or 9 years old, had replaced Edie as Harriet's babysitter. The sole responsibility for care of children would have been difficult work for boys and girls under 10 years of age. Watching an infant for many hours at a time would have required an 8 or 9-year-old's full attention, and it was a job that would have been made more arduous considering that Edie and Aggie were not living with their parents or each other when they had this specific position. In the Upper South on the small farms and in the Lower South on large cotton plantations, young children were frequently placed in a group called the trash gang. A trash gang was a form of group work that operated under the gang system, which meant that everyone worked together from dawn until dusk, supervised by an overseer. Trash gangs did not just consist of children, but also of pregnant women and elderly enslaved persons who could no longer perform other work. They collected trash around the property, pulled and chopped weeds, bound and stacked wheat, and picked any leftover cotton that the regular gang had missed. They were also responsible for picking worms off of the tobacco plants, as small children in particular were the right size to pluck and kill the worms. Children who were enslaved in the Low Country did not work in the gang system. They worked according to the task system. According to the task or piecework system, for 6 days a week, field hands were assigned a fixed amount of work which they were required to complete by sundown. Young children in the Low Country were tasked with a variety of jobs, including scaring birds away from the rice and corn and working in the fields, clearing ditches and building canals for cultivating rice. Generally, children did not perform routinized jobs until age 10 and after. At that time, they were classified as either quarter hand or half hand, depending on their age and strength. Additionally, once children began routinized work, they also worked more gender-specific jobs. On small farms in the Upper South, the average age that the children began working with adults was 8 or 9 years old, compared to children in the Low Country that began working in the rice fields at a later age, around 12 to 14 years old. Historian Marie Jenkins Schwartz maintains that by age 10 or 12, most children were capable of working alongside adults in the fields. When it came time to work gender-specific jobs, enslaved boys were given tasks that required more physical strength. They were often in charge of driving mules in the cotton gin as well as plowing. Boys would also fell trees and chop them for firewood. Enslaved boys had more opportunities than enslaved girls to learn artisan skills like cobblers, carpenters, smiths, masons, wrights, and coopers. Some boys were required to work as chimney sweeps when the chimneys needed cleaning. Cleaning chimneys was one such chore in which small boys, generally under 12 years of age, crawled into cramped spaces and maneuvered into small zigzag chimneys with scrapers to remove soot from flues. Cleaning chimneys was extremely dangerous, as the boys would have to climb up great heights in chimneys that were sometimes still warm and were exposed to toxic waste elements from fire, tar, and smoke. There are multiple serious health risks associated with chimney sweeping, including cuts becoming infected with soot and developing into calluses, soot becoming embedded in the scrotum and causing cancer, soot becoming embedded in the eyes and causing them to be perpetually red, and the danger of tuberculosis from soot in the lungs. A notation from one of George Washington's ledgers indicates that a cap for Richmond to sweep the chimneys was purchased in 1791. Richmond was the 13-year-old son of Washington's enslaved cook Hercules, and he worked as a kitchen scullion during Washington's presidency in Philadelphia. The plural use of chimneys indicates that Richmond was responsible for sweeping multiple chimneys in the home, if not all of them. If they were not working as field laborers, enslaved girls were often responsible for jobs related to domestic activities. At Monticello, Thomas Jefferson stipulated that girls aged 10 to 16 should spin, referring to spinning cloth. In 1812, he opened a textile factory on the Lego farm across the Rivanna River from Monticello. His annual goal was to produce 1,200 yards of cloth woven from both purchased cotton and from the hemp and wool produced on his own farms. Though a few women and young boys were employed at the textile factory, Jefferson implied that the bulk of the work was to be done by girls too young to go into the fields. Barring field labor, working as a kitchen scullion was one of the few routinized jobs that was not gender-specific. Both girls and boys were trained as scullions in the kitchen, just as both men and women could be cooks. Though there were usually 1 or 2 cooks on a plantation, there were always multiple helpers working in the kitchen. Preparing meals for enslavers and their families was difficult work, especially on wealthy plantations where enslavers would hold large parties or entertain multiple guests at dinner. Historian Lenny Sorensen explained how certain children became scullions. The cook has an idea of suitability to become a cook. Some children are better suited than others to understand the dynamic in the kitchen. A child would need to be discreet, had to defer to the cook and to the mistress, and had to understand hierarchies. Children would learn aspects of whatever the cook wanted, and not all scullions could be trained to become cooks. Some scullions just did the kitchen chores that needed to be done, such as turning the spit, shelling peas, and plucking chickens. Only the children who showed a real penchant for cooking would be trained to cook. Sorensen says that children would have been recruited to work in the kitchen around the ages of 6 to 8 for tasks like bringing firewood in and throwing ashes out. Age and temperament also factored into who would have been chosen. The kitchen was a dangerous place for young children. People cooked using open fires, there were hot pots and pans, and the kitchen was constantly filled with multiple people doing various jobs. As scullions, children were usually small and often barefoot, as most slaveholders did not give children shoes until they were sent to the fields to work. People were constantly getting burned, and the cotton garments that many enslaved people wore caught on fire easily. There were many complex interactions and reactions occurring in the kitchen, and children had to learn and be aware of these in order to understand the kitchen dynamic. So how can enslaved children be represented archaeologically? In order to be able to interpret the presence of enslaved children within the archaeological record, it is crucial to understand the child-rearing processes and labor roles that I have just discussed. As many of the artifacts related to enslaved children are not immediately obvious or may be simply considered utilitarian items used only by adults. Archaeologist Crystal Dozier's 2016 article, Finding Children Without Toys, The Archaeology of Children at Shibona Grove, Illinois, has been most helpful for conceptualizing how children may be identified archaeologically without the presence of child-specific artifacts. Dozier developed 2 categories of artifacts relating to children: formal or child-specific material culture, and informal or adult-specific material culture. Formal material culture dominates the discussion of childhood in historical archaeology through recognizable toys like marbles, dolls, books, and the like. Child-specific material culture also refers to the personal effects of children: shoes, buttons, ribbons, pacifiers, cradles, and clothing. The second category, informal material culture, is problematic in most archaeological assemblages because the primary function of the materials may be utilitarian. This category is called adult-specific material culture because archaeologists traditionally understand those things that are not marked for children as part of adult practices. This second category could be comprised of almost anything, as children interacted with a variety of types of material culture. According to Dozier, by restricting the archaeological interpretations of the lives of children to child-specific material culture, many researchers let questions regarding agency and individuality fall through the cracks. Although archaeologists have been successfully identifying enslaved children through formal child-specific material culture at quarter sites, they have largely been ignoring the possibility of informal material culture. Examples of informal material culture relating to the activities of enslaved children include sewing implements, cooking tools, and agricultural equipment. Though it isn't possible to definitively assert that any of these artifacts were utilized by enslaved children at a particular site, consulting archival documents related to the site may provide more information about children enslaved there and their possible tasks or jobs. Additionally, the possibility of archaeological evidence of nursery buildings is extremely compelling, although thus far no nurseries have been successfully documented archaeologically. Enslaved children as contributors to the enslaved family and community. Thomas Jefferson's memorandum books and Anne Carey Randolph's household accounts book are important sources of information for understanding enslaved children as contributors to the enslaved family and community. Anne Carey Randolph was Thomas Jefferson's granddaughter and kept records of household purchases from 1805 to 1808. She purchased many things for for the household from Jefferson's enslaved workers, such as eggs, honey, and produce. According to archaeologist Barbara Heath, account books can be used to study enslaved workers as producers and consumers in order to gain a clearer understanding of how objects came into the quarter, the social dimensions of collection or production, trade and barter that resulted in purchasing power. On Sunday, May 25th, 1806, Anne recorded separate purchases of strawberries from Billy and Nancy. Billy, who would have been 6 or 7 years old, received 3 shillings for his 6 quarts of strawberries. Nancy, who would have been 14 or 15 years old, received 2 shillings for 4 quarts of strawberries. Billy must have returned with another 4 quarts of strawberries, as he is listed again and received 2 shillings for them. In the next daily entry, Anne paid Beverly 1 shilling and 6 pence for his 3 quarts of strawberries. Beverly was Jefferson's enslaved son and would have been 8 years old at the time. Anne's household accounts book provides documentation that enslaved children were picking strawberries together and selling them for money. How the children spent their money is unknown. They may have given it to their enslaved parents or used it to purchase things for themselves, such as candy or toys from local general stores. Regardless of how they spent it, the children were earning money as producers in the local economy of Monticello. Years later, in 1824, Thomas Jefferson purchased 100 cabbages and paid 2 shillings to Madison and Eston Hemmings, his 19 and 16-year-old enslaved sons, respectively. These account books demonstrate instances of enslaved children and teenagers being paid in cash for their produce. The instances are rare, but are nonetheless essential for understanding the ways that children during enslavement were able to earn money for themselves or their families. Furthermore, these exchanges may imply that children were participating in the market economy and may answer questions about how certain items or goods were introduced into the quarters. In archaeological contexts, the presence of small mammal bones, bird bones, fish bones, or oyster shells, as well as macrobotanical assemblages, including edible fruit or plants, are often interpreted as evidence of subsistence strategies, though it is always assumed that these activities were practiced by enslaved adults and never enslaved children. However, it is fairly well documented that during their free time, enslaved children hunted, fished, and engaged in other subsistence activities like collecting wild fruit or edible plants. Generally, enslaved adults worked from 9 to 15 hours a day, depending on their jobs, the season, and the type of plantation where they worked. Therefore, enslaved children before age 10 would have had more free time to hunt, fish, or pick berries than enslaved workers of any other age group, besides the superannuated slaves who did not have to work. Interviews from formerly enslaved individuals in the WPA slave narratives provide more information about hunting and fishing as activities done by children. Simon Stokes, a formerly enslaved man from Virginia, remembers hunting possum with his friends and bringing the meat back for his family, where his mother would roast them with sweet potatoes. Mary James, who was also formerly enslaved in Virginia, recalled that her mother would cook her food after she finished working for the day. Quote, "We would catch rabbits in gums or traps, and as we lived on the rivers, we ate any kind of fish we caught." Mary's recollections imply that she and the other children were responsible for catching the rabbits, and her mother would cook their dinners in the evenings. A.C. Thomas, a formerly enslaved man from Florida, remembers spending the early years of his childhood with other enslaved children on the plantation. They waded in the streams, fished, chased rabbits, and always knew where the choicest berries and nuts grew. Elisha Gary, who was formerly enslaved in Hart County, Georgia, caught possum, rabbits, fish, and frogs with his hound dog. He also trapped partridges. And Tom Hawkins, who was enslaved as a child in North Carolina, detailed the techniques used to catch possum and rabbit. They caught them in traps, hit them with rocks, and trailed them with dogs, remembering that children also caught heaps of fish with a hook and line, while enslaved adults employed a seine for fishing. In this context, hunting and fishing can be understood as more than just recreational activities, but as important ways that children were able to supplement their family's diet, thus contributing to the survival of themselves and their families during enslavement. Olga Linares' concept of garden hunting is especially useful when considering enslaved children in these roles. In her study of subsistence patterns in the American tropics, Linares found that certain groups hunted small mammals in house gardens and cultivated fields, thus concentrating the supply of both carbohydrates and animal protein. Termed garden hunting, this game procurement system was more akin to harvesting vegetable products and maritime resources. I posit that subsistence methods practiced by the enslaved community can be understood as a form of garden hunting, with enslaved children often filling the roles of garden hunters. Ecological theories such as optimal foraging theory may help one understand how children during enslavement may have contributed fish, small game, or other food sources to the diet of their families and communities. Archaeologist Gillian Gall successfully uses this theory in her work on enslaved children's contributions to the market activities of enslaved households at Stewart Castle in 18th century Jamaica. Gall draws on the work of archaeologists Douglas and Rebecca Bird, who utilize ethnoarchaeology to comprehend children's contributions to the archaeological record in order to understand the role of children in human evolution. The Birds have studied the foraging strategies of the Meriam children of the eastern Torres Strait and the hunting strategies of the Mardu children in the western desert of Australia. Gall found that children, when foraging, choose a wider range of prey compared to adults, and the prey is of lower profitability. Additionally, where the costs of processing differ between children and adults, the resources that children exploit are more likely to end up in middens because children will carry resources home to process or to find help for processing, whereas adults are able to process resources away from home. Gall focused specifically on shellfish processing in her study, but it may be possible to apply this methodology to other kinds of faunal material. She found that enslaved households at Stewart Castle began to rely on the resources foraged by children for food at home, and that highly ranked high trophic level fish caught by enslaved adults were likely sold at local markets, allowing for the procurement of fashionable and expensive refined earthenwares and other luxury goods which were present at the site. Gall concluded that the children's labor was critical to household economies at Stewart Castle. The conditions and economy of 18th century Jamaica differ greatly from those of the 19th century southern United States. However, attempting to utilize Gall's methodology in regard to faunal assemblages from quarter sites in the Antebellum US may provide more information about the foraging and hunting strategies of enslaved children at those sites. I plan on conducting this research over the summer as a part of my Material Culture Fellowship with the Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery. So finally, how can the limitations of archaeological evidence regarding enslaved children provide a contribution to the understanding of American slavery? This question must be asked because more often than not, the archaeology is simply not there. This is a significant problem considering that this dissertation is about archaeology and posits that an archaeology of enslaved children exists. Certainly artifacts that represent enslaved children do exist, most typically represented by toys and child-sized objects. But what does it mean that the vast majority of artifacts that were used daily by children during enslavement cannot be attributed to them? Why haven't any nursery buildings been successfully identified and excavated when it is clear that they existed? The limitations of the archaeological record make a dissertation on the topic of the archaeology of enslaved children quite difficult, but it is worthwhile to consider the implications and meaning of an absence of archaeological artifacts. A lack of artifacts representing enslaved children does not mean that they do not exist. Rather, they do exist, but nobody has applied the correct lens through which to interpret them yet. The limitations of the archaeological record are similar to the limitations of the archive. Saidiya Hartman addressed this problem with the archives in her article, Venus in Two Acts, where she discusses the lack of information about enslaved women who may only be represented by a single name in a ledger or on a ship manifest. Hartman asks, is it possible to exceed or negotiate the constitutive limits of the archive? She suggests a possible solution to this problem through her concept of critical fabulation. Quote, the intention here isn't anything as miraculous as recovering the lives of the enslaved or redeeming the dead, but rather laboring to paint as full a picture of the lives of the captives as possible. Hartman interrogates the archives to provide more insight into the lives of the enslaved. In the archives, they might appear as a single name on a ledger, but through critical fabulation, the possibilities of what they endured and witnessed become clearer. Quote, by advancing a series of speculative arguments in fashioning a narrative which is based upon archival research, and by that I mean a critical reading of the archive that mimes the figurative dimensions of history, I intended both to tell an impossible story and to amplify the impossibility of its telling. Hartman uses critical fabulation not to fill in the gaps and provide closure, which she cautions against, but to, quote, imagine what cannot be verified. Hartman's concept of critical fabulation can be applied to my research in order to negotiate the limits of the archaeological record and to consider the numerous potentialities for enslaved children to be represented in the archaeological record. The Federal Writers Project slave narratives and other individually published narratives and autobiographies of formerly enslaved individuals are critical to this endeavor. These are accounts from people who lived through a childhood in enslavement and through their stories share information about material culture that can be associated with enslaved children. Ultimately, the limitations of archaeological evidence of enslaved children are challenging, but not impossible. Of course, a thimble may just be a thimble, but to ignore the very real possibility that the thimble was an object used primarily by an enslaved child and which impacted his or her daily life is to purposefully exclude those children from archaeological interpretations. The primary goal of this dissertation is to identify enslaved children in the archaeological record and to recognize them as individuals who were as likely as adults to be represented archaeologically. There is a vast amount of evidence that demonstrates enslaved children were capable of so many things. They were responsible for difficult jobs, they contributed to their families, they earned their own money, and they sometimes sought freedom through self-emancipation without the help of adults. Whether it can be proven that any specific artifact is associated with enslaved children is not entirely relevant, but the possibility for them to be considered in an interpretation must exist, and currently it does not. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samantha. That was truly enlightening. We do have some questions, and we want to open this up. So I can read the first question that we have. It states, you mentioned defining children as under 14 years of age. Would slave owners have considered 14 to be the majority age, or did they have different conceptions about minority/majority age? Did minority/majority age for enslaved children different from non-enslaved?
Okay, so yes, basically for this dissertation project, I kind of had to choose parameters for what defines a child. But in fact, the more research I do, the more I realize enslavers didn't really think of enslaved children as children at all. They were investments for future monetary profit, or they were investments as future workers, free labor. And so I think maybe the question is getting at more of when did enslavers have children working more of these more difficult jobs in the fields or working in kitchens, and that would vary by region. I didn't have a lot of time here to talk about regional differences, but by the early 1800s in the Upper South, they had mostly stopped focusing on tobacco and were running small farms, and these states were known as selling states because they sold enslaved people to the Lower South, where there were plantations that grew cotton and rice, tobacco, sugarcane, indigo, crops that required a lot of manpower. So it really depended by region and by plantation when a child who wasn't really considered a child would start working the jobs of an adult. And there are instances where children that are 6, 7, 8 are also picking cotton in the fields. So does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions for Samantha? And you feel free to put the question in the chat, or else you're welcome to just speak out and ask.
I have a question. This is Garrett, an old friend of Samantha. Samantha, great job. I have a question about the nurseries. Have you been able to identify a site, perhaps, that actually has a possible intact nursery? Not that you could just barge in, I suppose, and demand to dig that, but tell us a little bit about some of that work. Are there nurseries out there?
Yeah, I do think there are. And in fact, I actually found I think 5 or 6 insurance policies from the Mutual Assurance Company out of Virginia for nursery buildings, which is strange because from all the research I've done, there really weren't many nurseries in Virginia just because of how small farms or plantations were. But there are definitely names of plantations where there were nurseries, and like that photograph from Hilton Head, I think I looked into it, and like that plantation has like fallen into the ocean because of like seawater rise and like erosion. And I haven't been able to put a lot of energy into identifying like the horseshoe plantation in Florida, and then the Hopeton Plantation in Georgia. But I do know that I think 3 years ago, a field school in Florida, I want to say it was like University of Western Florida or West Florida, was digging at the Arcadia Mills site, and they were looking for the nursery there because there were records of it, but they didn't find it that field season. And I don't know if, I haven't heard that they've found it since then. But there are certainly, I think, a lot of nurseries to be found, especially in the lower South and low country.
We have another question for you, Samantha. This one comes from Sherry Huerta. Do you have plans to go on digs for your research looking for specific spaces where children might have been present?
Currently, no. I'm trying to do my dissertation with already existing artifact collections. So most of that is coming from DAX, the Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery. And that's for 2 reasons. One is that it's just more time efficient and less expensive to use already existing collections. But I also think that with the lack of space for storing artifacts that archaeologists are kind of running into, and just like tons of existing collections that really haven't been used for research that are just sitting in storage, I think it's interesting to try to apply this methodology into an already existing collection that hasn't been studied in this way yet. But I don't have any plans to dig for the dissertation, but if I graduate, who knows after that.
Not if you graduate, when you graduate.
When I graduate.
Right. Another question here. This one is from Priscilla Lynn. How did the labor of poor white children differ from that of child slaves, aside from the status of freedom? Did wealthy children have no doubt privileged lives?
Yeah, so wealthy children, the big difference between wealthy, I guess, free white children and enslaved children is that they did have a very distinct period of childhood. And there are books, historical books out there that outline how to raise your kids 101 for white women. But I think the question about poor white children, I don't know. I haven't looked into that, but that is a great question. But I think it wouldn't have been out of the realm of possibility for them to do the same kind of work on their own, parents' small farms, but certainly at large plantations where the children were wealthy, they did not do work. Yeah, I don't know very much about it, but that is something to keep in mind.
Sherry adds that she agrees about time and space considerations, and she loves that you are thinking about new ways and analyzing and interpreting existing finds.
Thank you.
We want to get that on the record there. Any other questions or comments for Samantha? Okay, we have one. Kaylee Sang. Have you come across the treatment of indentured children on plantations?
I have not. I've been focused, so I've been focusing mostly on the period before the Civil War, like 1800 to 1860. And from what I know about indentured servants, I think it was maybe a bit earlier than that, like late 18th century. Although that could be a good thing to consider when considering poor white children who may have been hired out in that way. But I haven't come across any instances of indentured white children on plantations where there were enslaved children.
Another question. Most of your discussion of labor seemed to focus on farm labor. Can you speak to any differences in other types of labor, particularly factory or manufacturing labor?
No. I've been focusing on plantations, so I don't know.
Okay. Trinity Ashley asks, did you look at or consider skeletal remains of enslaved children? If so, what did they reveal about the lives, health, work, etc. of those children?
I haven't considered looking at skeletal remains, and I don't know how I would have. I think it might be difficult to get access to something like that. I don't know, but that would be, I mean, that would certainly be interesting to be able to see the results of labor on a child's body. I mean, well, the sad part is, like, not most, but some of these children didn't make it to adulthood. And so I suppose if you were studying the child of or the body of I think they call them subadults in using the bio. But yeah, that's definitely an interesting point that I haven't thought of yet.
Russell Belcher comments and says, thank you, Samantha. You have opened a new door on slavery. Thinking about selling children by the inch or by the pound is chilling and helps to explain the insensitivity and dehumanization of some portion of the white population of this country. Any other questions?
I have a question. I have a question that you probably can't answer, Samantha, because I don't think anybody's looked into it. But I'm wondering what effect this sort of life has on the development of children physically, the cognitive development, and or also the emotional development. Have you run into anything written about this?
No, I don't know. And I think that question's difficult because certainly from skeletal remains, you can see evidence of physical trauma on the body. I know from from teeth as well. You can see evidence of if they were not eating or not being fed enough, if they were starving, there's evidence of that. There's evidence of stress on bones, but I think it's difficult to talk about mentally how a childhood during enslavement would have affected children or adults for that matter, because most of the narratives that we have are either self-published narratives or autobiographies, or they come from the WPA slave narratives. And while those narratives are full of information that can help researchers studying slavery, there's also many problems with them, and that is that they were interviewed by white people at a time during like the Jim Crow era, and so they may not have actually like wanted to tell them any like maybe traumatic stories or the way that they felt that enslavement affected them during childhood or later life. So for something like that, those narratives are unreliable. But for other things, they're extremely helpful, so they shouldn't be written off. But yeah, I don't know.
Thanks.
We have a question from Marlena Martin. Can you speak a bit more on what critical fabulation would look like in archaeology, and what other fields it might engage?
Okay, this is a good question. For me, the way that Hartman uses critical fabulation and the way that she like makes it very clear that you're not supposed to fill in the gaps or provide closure, like, you know, make up a narrative. I think that that's really important, and it is a really good tool for historical archaeologists, because basically she's just positing like, imagine the possibilities of an incident, right? So like, for instance, the only thing that, well, not the only thing, but one of the only things we know about Richmond, who was an enslaved child of George Washington's, comes from these like very small notations in ledgers, like when he wrote that he bought a cap for him to clean the chimney. And I think for most of the time, chimney sweeps only wore like underwear and this cap sort of to cover their faces. But from that notation, you know, we learn a lot more about Richmond as an individual, that he was, while he was working as a scullion in the kitchen of the president, and his enslaved father was the chef, he also would have been responsible for like a dangerous task like sweeping the chimneys, and there were definitely multiple chimneys in the president's home in Philadelphia. And so just from like a single notation like that, it's possible to understand more about the context and about the situation, and about the like labor that children were responsible for. And then maybe, you know, consider like, how did he feel about that? Obviously he probably didn't have a choice. He was one of the only young boys employed in the household at Washington's house in Philadelphia, because he didn't bring a ton of enslaved people, because it was actually, after 6 months, they were free according to the laws of the city. So he would actually like take them out for a day out of state and then bring them right back to sort of like reset the clock so that none of them could be freed. But yeah, that's what I am thinking of when I think of critical fabulation in terms of archaeology, and like in looking at an artifact, like what could this artifact mean? Like any artifact could have a bunch of meanings, hundreds of meanings. But for me, with this dissertation, it's that I'm really bothered when people sort of, you know, this marble belonged to a child and that's it on the site. When that's not true. I mean, they weren't treated as children. And I think also we shouldn't assume that their parents treated them as children. Just because there's a diminutive teacup on the site doesn't mean that they thought of them as children. They thought of them as their own offspring, but they knew the seriousness of the status of being enslaved and what they had to prepare their children for. So I kind of rambled there, but I think that her concept of critical fabulation could be helpful for a lot of other fields, including American studies, like material culture studies. She's a historian, I think, so she uses it for history.
As Zev Kosin shares, the findings from the African burial ground on higher rates of infant mortality may offer some insights on one of the previous questions that was mentioned. And another question we have is, do you have any sense of what the mortality rate among enslaved children might have been? And were there regional differences in those statistics?
Yes, I don't have the statistics on hand right now, excuse me, but they definitely varied by region. And the mortality rates were so bad in the Low Country, like on rice plantations, because of like malaria and all kinds of like swamp diseases, that wealthy enslavers would actually move enslaved children, to a separate camp in the summer, like a few miles away from the rice paddies, so that they would be less susceptible to diseases. And there is a narrative that I don't remember right now, but he discusses it in his narrative that he would have to move every summer, and then on the weekends, the enslaved parents were allowed to come, I think, during Sunday to visit their kids.
Any other questions?
I just had one comment. This is John. It was a wonderful presentation, Samantha. And you have us thinking as archaeologists now about our interpretations. Definitely, you have me thinking now about some past excavations we've done. So
Thank you.
may relook at those reports now and see if we have different interpretations.
Thank you. That's exciting for me. So
And look forward to seeing your dissertation when it's published. So.
You've certainly showed us through your work the absolute horror that slavery was for everyone, especially for children. And, you know, I commend you for that. This is great work.
thank you. And
Yeah, I have to agree, Samantha. I thought that the, your speech was really great. I love the part about bringing out the nursery, because I think it makes us archaeologists think about what we might, uncover. The other part that I really enjoyed were when you were talking about the contributions children made to the household. It, gives me some new things to think about.
thank you. And I do just want to say that I didn't include many stories or instances of physical or mental violence against children. One, because I wanted to focus on the sort of general topics in my dissertation, but also I haven't quite learned how to deliver that kind of sensitive information to people yet, but I do encourage people and if you'd like to email me, I can put my email in the chat, or I'm sure Tara can give it to people. But I do encourage people to look into that more, because the violence against children is really staggering, and it's really painful. So yeah, there are days when I come across a story and that's just kind of it for the day, and I have to, let it go, change what I'm thinking about, and then come back later. But I think it's really important for people to read that kind of information, as painful as it is, and kind of, sit with that pain and think about why we don't learn about this in school, or why we don't know this. Because I think the United States obviously has a really big problem with reckoning with slavery in this country. And I think if more people knew exactly how it was, then we wouldn't have such a big problem. So it's time to accept that these things happened. So yes, Terry Lee, and acknowledge the pain. Yeah.
Definitely acknowledgement of that pain. Marlena asks, would novels such as Toni Morrison's Beloved contribute to critical fabulation, or are the disciplines too different? Added on to that question, you were mindful to refer to enslaved children rather than child slaves, or African descendant children, etc. Is this purposeful? And do you engage racism in any explicit way beyond humans as labor and capital?
Okay. Full disclosure, and it's probably shocking, I have not read Beloved, but I own it. I actually own a lot of books about slavery that are historical fiction, but especially since the beginning of the pandemic, I've been having a really difficult time engaging in books or like media that, like, I still can't watch 12 Years a Slave. Like, I know I just can't, that portrays slavery. And I kind of, just for me right now, I have to kind of be like, this is my research, this is my work, and I care deeply about it. But in order for me mentally, I have to kind of, watch movies about like vampires or something and like get out of the mindset. So I don't know the first question, even though I will read it one day. Right now I know I can't. And then, yes, I like to use the term enslaved children because they were children and individuals and humans first, and the condition of being enslaved was something that was done to them. They were born and then given the status of enslaved. And so I don't know if anyone has read like Dr. P. Gabrielle Foreman's work on how to talk about slavery, but it's a really great resource on like what words we should consider to stop using, and like what words are better used. So like instead of saying like a runaway slave, you might say like an enslaved person seeking emancipation, or like self-emancipating, because it really takes away like making the person a slave, which they weren't. They were a person, and it sort of changes how people understand slavery. And then, do you engage racism in any explicit way beyond humans as labor and capital? Is the third question like in my dissertation research? Like, is that what it pertains to? Okay. I have not yet. I haven't. But maybe we can talk, Marlena, about this, because I'm interested in the question and I don't quite know. I don't know, because racism in slavery studies is so explicit. I haven't thought beyond what I've been doing, but I would like to talk about it with you and learn more.
So I want to see if there are any other individuals out there who would have any final comments or questions for Samantha.
I have a final comment. Sorry. This is not a question, it's just a comment.
Please.
Samantha, you know, I'm not an archaeologist at all, but I appreciate you explaining this in such a very clear way that even a engineer like myself can understand. And really excellent talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Yes, I think, Samantha, you've really done a marvelous job sharing your research and certainly in something that is, I would say, most definitely timely with all the other ugly realities that have come out during this pandemic, seeing, for instance, the social inequity that has manifested at so many levels, and unfortunately to see that still has origins from so long ago, and how this nation first came to be. And it's still, for that reason, I think it's even more important to address these and highlight these kinds of topics in light of what's happening in our society. We have a final comment. Thank you so much for an informative and important talk about the lives of enslaved children. There is tremendous research here and important stories to recover and tell. So one last final opportunity in case anyone has any urgent questions. We'll stay on a little bit afterwards in case anyone wants to reach out to Samantha. But in case there are, before we do wrap up, I want to make mention that next month, April 7th, Zev Kosin will be presenting for us on the topic of his research, From Flocks of Sheep to Bunches of Roses, Archaeology and Ecological Transformation, Labor and the Hacienda System in Cayambe, Ecuador. And then in May, on the 4th, Deborah Tannen will be speaking on her book, Finding My Father, His Century-Long Journey from World War I and My Quest to Follow. So we hope you can join us for both of those events in April as well as in May. If no other final questions or comments, I want to thank everyone out there for joining us. A big thanks especially to you, Samantha, also
Yes.
to Tara, and to Suzanne, and
Thank you,
Matt.
Monica.
That's okay. But Matt, who's behind the scenes, making
And Matt, yes.
all of this possible virtually, a big shout out to Matt. And of course, wishing you all a good evening and to stay safe out there. We look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Samantha.
Thank you. Thank you to Monica and Suzanne, and thanks especially to Tara for asking me to talk. I'm really appreciative of this opportunity. So thank you.
That was great.
Well done.